down the tube. So if they can reduce the count, then they reduce the amount that goes to states, the allocation of money and stuff. But more important, that's a game that they're playing to forestall their loss of power in this country. But the point is, 31, 32, 3300 BCE, Kemet got them a census, and you better believe it was accurate because people there didn't lie. I have to admit, a lot of times they didn't even interview me on a census. I didn't want to be interviewed. You can debate about that, but that's the truth. How is it that in the first dynasty, Kemet has one of the most advanced astronomical and astrological systems known to human history? And I pointed this out before. Herodotus noted that the Kemites gave birth to astrology, according to them. The Kemites told them that by the time, date, place, and year of a person's birth, they could foretell their life, their destiny, and what type of person they would be and how they would die. Now, I'm an astrologer, and I'm both a historical astrologer and a political one. We don't have the skill to do that, and I wouldn't want to be able to do that, to predict how people's lives would go. But they were advanced enough, apparently, to do it. But astronomy went along with astrology because physics and metaphysics, the spiritual and the non-spiritual go together, and they were never separate in the ancient system. So you could apply this to yourself. So some of the stuff I'm going to deal with today, some have heard this before, but some of you are going to have trouble with it because you've been spookified out of this. The Catholic Church has treated astrology as spookology. And as a result, a lot of people are afraid to touch it and see it as something that is not really real. And so some of you will have a little bit of trouble with this, but I'll be explaining this to the best of my ability, and hopefully you'll get it, But astronomy is going to be one of the methods used in explaining how this system works, and particularly the ancient Kemetic past. So you've got the first dynasty, you've got a fully developed priesthood. Think about that. It takes a long time to develop. And it should be noted, and I, in a previous show, made this point, that the Kemites, and particularly the founders of Kemet, who we'll be discussing shortly, they were masters of astronomy. And there's a place in ancient Kemet called Nabta, N-A-B-T-A, Playa, P-L-A-Y-A. And my best friend, Andy Solawazi, had recommended this book to me, and you all should read it, The Origin Map. And what you're seeing, those circles are actually megaliths done by ancient Kemites. And these same megaliths, not as advanced, are found in England, Stonehenge. And the historians, and I noted this in one of the series on the Twa, note that the Aryan or European did not build those. He said the Twa did. And we're going to see who these Twa were in dynastic Kemet and pre-dynastic Kemet, particularly pre-dynastic Kemet. So this is one of the Stonehenges found at this place, Nabta Playa, which is close to where the Giza pyramids are today. And this is tracing the movement of the star system Orion. And those six upright slabs there, those duplicate Orion. And Orion is at the origin of the stellar system of our Milky Way, which is the neighborhood that we live in the stellar universe. And Orion is associated with a SAR, because he's at the origin of Kemetic history. Africans are real interested in origin and in roots. And that's why if you're dealing with Dogon astrophysics or anything else, it tends to be more advanced than Western astrophysics because it is expert on origins. And as a result of its expertise on origin, it is able to deal with roots or foundations. So this show is going to focus on the roots of Kemetic civilization. Where did it start? Who brought it into being? And we're going to use a variety of types of evidence to support this. One of the most important questions we're going to answer is how the first dynasty comes into being with a fully formed governance system, a Pharaonic system. How did that happen? That is the high point of the presentation today, is where the governance system of Kemet came from. And key to that is a balanced family system or balanced social structure. This is the most important thing when it comes to civilization, is the family system that civilization rests on. So this is part of what we'll be addressing today. Now, I'm going to use some methods for historical analysis that some historians don't use, and I found very useful because they work. I'm a historian, political thinker, and philosopher. Those are three areas. And then there's a lot of stuff underneath that. The key thing is with the way I view history is I view it in a cyclical way because history moves in cycles. The way planets move elliptically, usually in a spiral motion, sometimes in a circular motion, then that is tied to how history moves cyclically. You have rise and fall. You have different stages in societies. And so one of the methods that I found very useful, and I use a lot of different methods for historical analysis, is astronomy and astrology, and particularly what's called the procession of the equinoxes, which I'm going to go into in a minute, which is a key aid in understanding the psychology, the philosophy, the history of a period, where people's heads were at a particular historical period. And one of the things that I find that is very interesting is that as above, so below, that the stellar stuff affects the whole world. So when certain cycles, what's called procession, that I'll explain in a minute, occur, you find the whole world going through a similar set of stages in history. And that's because it's like you have a geographical climate, or you have a biological reality, or you have a cellular structure, and those influence how people behave, think, and are. So you have an astronomical, astrological climate. And everything that's physical out there in the cosmos is spirit-based. And they all have energies. And so when I deal with processional cycles, I'm going to be showing you how those abstract things that are determined by certain astronomical, astrological signs, their energies affect an age. And you'll see just how closely. It doesn't mean determines what will happen, but it creates the climate, creates the perimeters. It usually defines the general areas in which a society moves. Now, whether they move right or wrong, whether people make good choices or not so good choices, those are their, those are those to make, because in history, it's all about free will with human beings and with history. But this simply sets the climate for that. You can be born into a bad family situation. That could affect you for the rest of your life. But you can make choices to transcend that. You know what I mean? Similarly, you can be born now into some terrible situations in our community where families are broken down, communities are broken down. Whereas God told me we're going through a choice between two cultures. Powerful forces that have hit our community since '68 have put some of our people in a position where they're stepping outside their culture. Some of them are behaving not even like they're human. And it's created a crisis where life is so miserable that young people are considering suicide and are doing it. And Blacks have the lowest suicide rate in this country. But between 7 and 11-year-olds, as I pointed out before, their suicide rates, even though it's a small number, is higher than the white suicide rate. Why would a baby consider suicide? Because it's a sick, broken society that we're living in. But even though you're living in such a crooked, diabolical society, it doesn't mean you have to be a reflection of that. So when I deal with processional cycles, I'm not saying this is the inevitable what had to happen. No, people had choices within that context. And in fact, the periods of greatest crisis in history are the periods of greatest growth. The 60s was a period of great crisis in this country. Black people were in struggle in the South and the North, went through a Black freedom movement, a Black power movement, a Pan-African movement, an Afrocentric movement, and so forth. And even though there was great crisis, some of our best thoughts and thinkers rose out of that. Malcolm X rose out of that. Activists, a King or an Ella Baker rose out of that, and an enrichment of our culture, soul music, the Temptations, Curtis Mayfield, Aretha Franklin, you know what I mean? The climate, which for those in power was chaotic, the disorder was a good thing for us because there was nobody that could really clamp down on us. They tried to, but we rose up. Just like enslaved Africans, when they said no, we said yes. When they said don't, we said we're going to do it. You know what I mean? That's been the resistant spirit of the African in America, the African around the world. So when I get into processional cycles, I'm not saying, oh, this had to happen. No, In the end, you've got your own choices to make. And some of the people who come through the worst situations in life, some of those end up being some of the best people. You hear me? Some of the best people. Even when they fall in the pit and lose some mother wit, eventually they get out of the pit and get wise. And some of us don't and die. That's the tragedy of it. But we're not a tragic people. So what I'm going to cover out of this 10,000-year slice, and it's only an overview, is 5,000 years of ancient Kemetic history. Just an overview. It's just an overview. And I know some of you have got things to add to that. And so I'm going to use a number of different tools in this examination to understand this historical period. One tool, as I've just said, is astronomy. Another tool is eyewitness accounts. That is, people who are actually there and observe things. And one of the key eyewitness people for this period is Herodotus. But I'm going to cover, he's a Greek historian who traveled in Egypt and observed things and also was told things. But he always distinguished what he was told from what he saw. And he saw some very important stuff. So some of the evidence I'm going to use, some of it will come directly from him. And of course, it comes from the accounts of our own people. And it comes also from anthropology and archaeology. So I'm going to be looking at some of the finds of pottery and various things made during this 9,500 BC period to show who the people were, give you an idea of what was going on. You understand? This is an area I spent a lot of time on, you know, because it's the root. If we're really going to know ourselves and the strength of our civilization, you need to know where they come from. And Kemet was definitely the greatest achievement in classical civilization in urban settings in the world. The Chwa were the greatest achievers of civilization in human history. And I spent a lot of time establishing that. And if you doubt it, go back and look at it. I'll summarize it briefly in a minute, but for the most part, you need to look at that. But they're generally written out of history again. Just as ancient Kemetic history is ignored, the history of the world's first people that goes back from 149,000 to 200,000 years ago is ignored. And without that, you would not have this great civilization of Kemet or the great civilizations of Africa or the great civilizations that you find in many different parts of the world, especially those that were just. So I'll be using to cover a 5,000-year slice of this 10,000-year period, and I'm only hitting it on the top. I'll be using astronomy, eyewitness accounts, anthropology, archaeology. And I'm also, it'll surprise you, be using some PowerPoint for this analysis. And that PowerPoint is designed to give us an understanding of this ancient period. So this is some of the area that will be covered, and I've purposely taken some time, a couple of years, to lay a foundation for this particular presentation. So first thing that I want to do is, in looking at this, is start off with the Chwa contribution to the history of ancient Kemet. And it's that Chwa contribution that is extremely important, since that's the foundation for African history. And I want to start here. And this is my favorite picture. You have seen this before. This is a picture of the Kung people of Kalahari Desert. According to mitochondrial DNA, they are the world's first people. And then the Chwa of the Congo are second in terms of age. But mitochondrial DNA gives them a lineage going back 149,000 years ago, give or take 10,000 years. That's the error rate of mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA of the mother. There would be no Kemetic history, no history of Africa, and no history of the world without these people and the Chwa of the Congo, who also made up part of the people who migrated into ancient Kemet. So the Chwa make certain contributions that are key to Kemetic civilization in the area of spirit, family structure, governance, medicine, astronomy, and other innovations in the arts and sciences. Now, the key to the Chwa period is this. The Chwa being the world's first people, and the Chwa series that I had on for a number of early shows, delved into why, first of all, the Chwa could create such just systems. And that's because they lived in a period that I would call a historic period of unicity or purity. And they call themselves the pure people, and they're not egotistical. They're just simply saying they were extremely, and still are, good people. And that goodness was the key. Their dedication to the truth, the living of the truth, was the key to their wisdom that endowed them with paranormal powers of the highest orders that enabled them to innovate civilization. First of all, to innovate human kindness as a standard for how people live. When John Henry Clark would use the term civil to define civilization, he was, on the one hand, using the most basic definition of civilization. I go well beyond that. Some of you have misinterpreted what I'm saying because some have said that's all I mean. No, you've been watching these shows? Hell no, a lot more. But it's at the foundation. That's the most important thing. When your behind goes upstairs and you go through the judgment, you ain't taking no money with you. You're not taking your car or your house with you. You understand? You're only taking one thing, your character. That's your eternal possession. And the Chwa, throughout history, have demonstrated the highest character because they, being God's first people, were closest to God and maintained a state of simplicity. And so a lot of us will reject this. Well, because they weren't living in pyramids or, they didn't build them. Actually, they did. That is, they built the civilization that built them. We'll come to that in a minute. But the fact of the matter is, they chose the simple path for a long period of history. So when you're getting into the higher spirit systems, whether it is the Hindu system or whether it's the spirit systems of Africa, the Ma'atan systems, or the systems of Native Americans or whatnot, they all have processes for getting you back in tune with your original nature and processes for overcoming the material realm and the physical realm that can bring you down. Passions like greed, jealousy, the material life. You know what I mean? So the Chwa live in this state of unicity where they're in oneness with God and oneness with nature. That's why they call themselves the pure people. And that is also why they had demonstrated and still to this day do demonstrate paranormal powers. That's why throughout Africa, a friend of mine who will be back on this show, Menu Ampin, he's been on the show before, and he's an expert on Martin Luther King, the revolutionary Martin Luther King. He's just completed 6 weeks of work in the Sudan. I'm going to have him on the show. He's going to do a slide presentation on his work in the Sudan. And he noted that in the Sudan, there's the wearing of the leopard skin. Well, if you look at the Chwa, who end up being the founders of this ancient Kemet, their greatest healers wore the leopard skin. Now, many of them were healers, but the greatest ones, they wore the leopard skin. They innovated medicine. Dr. Theophil Obenga says that the people in Congo, Brazzaville learned medicine through the Chwa. And they could heal a broken bone quick, but they had a spirit component to every physical component in their healing. In ancient Kemet, the priests who were doctors wore leopard skin. It comes from the Chwa. And of course, in dynastic Kemet, Herodotus tells us that doctors were so good that they had a specialist for every illness and every part of the body. And so if you had a bone problem, then it was a bone specialist. It was for the arm or the leg, or a heart problem, because they understood the circulation of blood, the heart. Imhotep was the father of medicine, but the father of medicine to them was the Chwa. And as I've just pointed out to you, in the Nabta Playa region of Kemet, where these stone hedges have been found, they were the ones who mastered astronomy during the pre-dynastic period, and particularly had a particular interest in Orion. So if you look at the pyramids that were built during the dynastic period, they are following the course of Orion that these ancient Africans had mastered. And some of these stone hedges found in Nabta Playa go back 16,500 years. That is, they were tracing the movement of Orion back 16,500 years. It doesn't mean they were there 16,500 years, but they knew the movement of Orion, which is the beginning of the stellar system in the Milky Way neighborhood that we live in. For you that are not into astronomy, the Milky Way is Earthlings, the people from Earth, stellar neighborhood. So the Chwa introduced that. The Chwa introduced spirit as a central feature of civilization. The Maasai say that they learn to worship God through the Chwa. And the Chwa give birth to the idea of one God, but not in the biblical or the Judaic or Islamic sense of just a teaching. The Chwa had connection to God. They were pure people. And so, as I pointed out in a previous show, the Chwa's conception of God is the most accurate of all, where God is described as these infinite forces, a part of which is distributed to everything God creates. Quantum physics confirms that everything in life is made up of energy. They don't understand this is a life force coming from God. And if they did, they wouldn't be involved in a mad project, mutual assured destruction, creating an atom bomb, because they have used energy only for the sole purpose of power. There's a comment here from M. Jewell. So leopard skin isn't necessarily associated to kingship or royalty, but medicine. It's essentially associated with medicine. Now remember, Pharaoh was chief priest, but in truth, he was not the highest healer in the kingdom. Those were priests that had that, and the highest in Kemet was Imhotep. Just as for us, the highest was George Washington Carver. He and Imhotep would have had some good conversations, and I bet they're having them in heaven, So the Chwa give birth to that. I pointed out that in a previous show that the Chwa played the role of civilizing the larger Africans. And particularly, I had a show dedicated to that. It was one of the shows during the New Year period where I was dealing with Chwa ancestral power. And it was showing how the Chwa took the Bantu people who come up from Southern Africa and civilized them. These are taller Africans. And they civilized them through teaching them against incest, proper way to have sex outside of your family line. They taught them how to make fire. They taught them how to smelt iron. They were into technology, and some of that technology was ahead of some of the later civilizations that would develop, and much more. The Chwa also give birth to a governance system in which all the males and females are equally empowered to govern every phase of society. As I pointed out before, the Trois gave birth to democracy. Now, that term democracy comes from Greece. Greece only practiced it in a few city-states for a short period of time and among only a few people, and then only males. But the African, because their lineage goes back to these Trois people that go back 144 to 200,000 years, this having a say-so in things is in our blood system. It's in our cellular structure. It's in our DNA. The African has to do things like that. Africa won't be straight until the people get their say-so, and especially sisters, because sisters have been moved out of power in Africa. And to the extent that they have in the U.S., the future of blacks in this country is also going to be based on the interplay and interaction and balance between males and females. So the Trois give birth to governments that are based on the equal empowerment of males and females. And I'll make mention of to the extent to which that was practiced in ancient Kemet. But for the purpose of this discussion, one of the most important contributions that the Trois make, being a just people, of course, is this notion of justice. They practice it, but I pointed out in previous shows that they term this Masuri, Maassouri. And that is the root of Ma'at. That meant straight, upright, just. That precedes Ma'at. I ran that past Obenga. He didn't object to it. But it wasn't just a concept. They practiced it 24/7. In Kemet and other African civilizations, they called for it. But as one of our viewers has pointed out, when you have a law, usually it's because it's been violated. And the Trois really didn't have laws that they had to follow because they were living in this era of simplicity where all their needs were easily met. Hunting, gather, activity took a very short period of time. And then you had leisure, and they lived in the real world as living, breathing, loving human beings. This picture you see of the father and his two children, I put that there. But of course, it would be the mother, it would be the grandmother, and it was the affection and love that they had for each other. But the most important legacy that the Trois left the Kemites and Africa in general was the twin lineal legacy of all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society. To the extent that Kemet followed this, and it didn't always, then to that degree, you measure it based on the fact that there was balance between males and females. There was an equal empowerment. The Trois were at a near perfect level on this. Other societies would fall off a little. But the most just societies in Africa, because we like the big ones, were after hunter-gatherer, were the classless age-grade societies that were small, agricultural, where all the males and females at the village level had an equal say-so in governing every phase of society. So today, we try and get back to this purity. The Trois lived in it. And that's only part of their legacy. And you need to go to the works that we have today that enables us to try and recover some of this purity, meaning spirit works. Some people are using meditation works. In ancient Kemet, it was Jeruma work, Gerumaa, which was the person who was self-mastered. Or the Bombara, it was Ma work, Maa. Notice the near similarity in the term. That was the ideal person, the self-mastered person who mastered the forces within them. The Trois didn't have to be taught that. To this day, they don't have to be, So the Trois laid the foundation for all of this. Now, One of the things that's very important in terms of understanding ancient Kemet is understanding how astronomy, astrology worked in understanding history in the lives of a people. And they were inseparable. So the Great Pyramids were astronomical observatories set along the course of a particular star, Orion being the most important. And I've been in the Great Temple, and some of you have, Khufu, which sits on the center of the earth. And as you walk up and down the passageway, that was an observation point for priests to observe stars. And so this is the picture of the Temple of Dendera in Kemet. And the Temple of Dendera in the ceiling contains this drawing. This is one done in script, and it was blasted out and then put in the museum in France. And then there's another that is still in Kemet. And so the Temple of Dendera is here recording the astrological or zodiac signs. And this is tied into what's called Procession of the equinoxes. I'm an astrologer. I've been one since 1963. I'm not going to give you a class on this. You won't understand how this works unless you actually do it. And I was somebody that was very suspicious of this. And it's only when my sister's godmother, who happened to be Mexican American, ran what's called a spot chart, which is a chart that you just needed an ephemeris, which is an astronomical table of the rotation of planets, where they are at any particular time. The best astronomical books are German, because they're very precise down to the minute, down to the millisecond. And so she took where my planets were when I was born and did a spot chart. Usually if I do a chart, it takes 30 hours to lay it out, translate it. Because astrology is basically the relationship, the angular relationship of planetary energies to each other. It's not just your sign. My sister, Sandrea Bradley, and I did a 3-part series on astrology. Go back and watch it. And you should check her out if you want your chart done. It is the best description of your destiny. Your chart is that path you picked in heaven. Your strengths and your weaknesses and a whole lot of other things that's called your Ka. That's basically what your astrological chart is. And you may not know it, you have it. And as I said before, just because planets are in a certain place, you have certain strengths and weaknesses, does not dictate what you'll do. That's free will. As they say, you would say, the choice is to be or not to be, playing off of, Shakespeare. To be yourself or not to be. There's only 2 ways on that one, So this here, the Temple of Dendera, in the inner circle, you see all the astrological signs. Up on the left-hand top corner, you see the crab. That's Cancer. To my right is Sagittarius, a being holding a bow. And then to its opposite side is a lion, Leo. And then 2 fish, Pisces, and so forth. So the inner circle are the zodiacal signs. Now in Kemet, they had a particular name for each of these signs. I won't go through all of them because I don't think anyone has successfully translated each of these signs into the correct Kemetic terminology. So where it's accurate, you'll see me using it. But other than that, I won't, because I'm not going to invent something that doesn't work. On the outer level of this, you have the stars. So this is the basis for understanding as above, so below from an astronomical level, because we're all stars. We're all made up of the same components of the stars in heaven. And we have our own rotational movement, which is our life, which is our life path, based on choices, but also based on gifts. And so to know yourself is to know yourself on many levels. To know yourself as an African or whatever your ethnicity is. To know your family background and stuff like that. But at the same time, to know yourself is also to know the astronomical component. As Einstein said, the universe is not a crapshoot. Everything in this universe has a purpose. And I'm going to tell you, the most rewarding thing for self-knowledge when it's come to internal spiritual self-knowledge has been my own astrological chart. And it's not just where the planets were when I was born. I'll give you a few examples of how this works. And I'm not trying to convince people to follow astrology or anything else. Malcolm X was a Taurus. Sun was in Taurus, his moon was in Aries. Now in astrology, the relationship between sun and moon, the solely lunar relationship, is extremely important because those are the workhorses of the heavens for Earth. The moon is really a filter for the sun. The moon regulates the movement of tides and other things. And the sun is the source of life and energy and so forth. So the relationship of sun and moon when you're born has a lot to do with how you approach life. Malcolm had the solely lunar relationship of sun in Taurus, moon in Aries. Now, the way it goes in astrology is Aries, Taurus, Gemini, so forth. So it means Aries is right behind his sun in Taurus, right behind. There are a few master astrologers, and I'm not one of them, who have been able to break through on certain areas of astronomy astrology to where it works. So there's a guy named Dane Rudar. He ain't black, but he's very good. And what he did is he came up with the lunation cycle, and it works. I'm into what works. And so he showed, based on the stage of the relationship of the sun and the moon when you're born, that kind of structures you. Doesn't mean you'll do that, but it shows you your range of potential. So the fact that Malcolm's moon was in Aries and it was behind his sun, that had a special meaning. And what did it mean? It meant that the moon had gone through all its cycles except its last cycle, just before it would go in after that to Taurus, which would be a new moon. You can't hardly see a new moon, you know? So what did that mean? It meant having gone through all the previous cycles, if that person's a higher order person who's concerned about humanity, they're going to pick up the vibrations of all these previous cycles. And they have the potential to be prophetic. My best friend, Kehinde Solowazi, has this thing, and I pointed out in previous shows, he's prophetic. Malcolm X was prophetic. I know plenty of people that have this solely lunar relationship who are not. One reason may be that they're wrapped up more in their own lives, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're raising a family and doing a job and stuff, and they may not be dedicating their lives to a bigger cause. And then some are, and they still don't demonstrate this prophetic capacity. So this is one of the things the solely lunar relationship indicates. The ability to prophesize. Malcolm had that. And at the same time, Garvey had that. And Garvey's moon and sun were in the same sign, Leo. But his moon was behind his sun. So he was still in this last solely lunar phase. He was prophetic. Malcolm X prophesied the rise of urban rebellions. He said it'll be hand grenades this year and it'll be something more next year. He prophesied the rise of Black power and Pan-Africanism. Garvey prophesied the rise of World War II and the involvement of Japan in that war, pretty precise, and that Africa would have this opportunity to free itself from colonialism, all of which was right. So this is the nature of what this is when it comes to a person. What I'm dealing with here is processional cycles. And processional cycles deal with the impact of these signs and the relationship of the Earth to the zodiac that I'm going to explain, that affects whole people. So just as the solar lunar relationship affects you, for example, with me, my sun is in Leo. My moon is in Pisces. Pisces comes after Aquarius. Had I had a moon in Aquarius, then I would have been in a cycle like John Coltrane, which can be a very creative cycle, you know, but it usually indicates solar lunar conflicts. There's a 180-degree opposition between sun and moon. Sun rules the masculine, moon rules the feminine, you know. So Coltrane had issues to work out in his family life. He's one of the masters I study in the book on Seva. And he was an average musician, but through practice became extraordinary. And when he did, he became an innovator. From somebody that could barely play, had only one natural musical gift, which was wisdom, he innovated 4 schools of music, showing you that the stars don't just dictate, your discipline does, baby. You know what I mean? Huh? You can take something average and be extraordinary if you work at it. In my case, because the moon comes after the full moon, what that indicates is people in that phase are disseminators. That is, they like to share what they know. But I happen to have also been able to be privileged to do innovation. But that's taken hard work. So that's in part how it works with the person. It's the relationship of planets to each other. It's not just your sun sign. And so here we're going to look at what's called processional cycles tied to this. I'll come back to this in a minute. So this is an example of how precession of the equinoxes work. You have here the Earth in its orbit, and it has a 365-day-a-year orbit, you know, around the sun. And so that's the Earth axis, its rotation. Precession of the equinoxes describes a 26,000-year rotation, subdivided into 2,100 years. And so the way the Earth is inclined towards any one of these zodiacal symbols, whether it's Leo right now, astrologers generally agree you're at the end of Pisces, the beginning of Aquarius. And so this is an age where you're going to see religious confusion, for example. Look what's going on in Iran. Look at all these mega right-wing Republicans. You know what I mean? Look at the Supreme Court decision on abortion, where they're treating a woman's right to choose whether they'll carry life or not as some kind of religious law enacted by some of the most lawless, dishonest creatures on the planet, Supreme Court justices, who gave us George Bush II, that gave us Iraq and Afghanistan off of an arbitrary Supreme Court decision. So if you're looking at this age, you're transiting between this Piscean age, which is more religious, oriented. That doesn't mean high, because a lot of wars were fought in the name of religion. John Henry Clark called the three monotheistic religion male killer cults. Because a lot of blood was shed in the name of God, and of course, in the name of capital and money. So that's because, what I'll explain in a minute, the Earth's precession of the equinoxes is pointed towards Pisces, and now it's shifting into Aquarius, which means you're going to see a lot of upheaval, and it's beginning. This past century was a century of upheaval. You had the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and today you have upheaval caused by this mad science that has waged war on nature. And so as a result, global warming, floods, extreme weather patterns, and everything else. This is not a revolution caused by Pisces or Aquarius. This is caused by the misuse of science, a mad science that's out to control nature rather than living in harmony with nature. So this is an example of how the Earth's relationship to one of these zodiacal signs has an influence for approximately 2,100 years out of this 26,000 year cycle on what happens on Earth. The key thing to note is when you're going through certain historical periods, you will see the whole world is generally going through those periods. When you go through the period of royalty and kings and queens, you had various kinds, but it was all over the planet. You had the best mankind or woman that comes out of Africa, where that person didn't have sole power over everything. They were accountable to a people. That's what I call royal democracy. But then you had these autocracies in Europe, and then you had the emperors in China, and then you also had royal systems among some Native Americans, particularly the Mesoamerican ones, the Mayans, Aztecs, Incas, Toltecs. Same things going on. What's causing that? People making choices. Culture is helping to drive it, which astrology does not have anything to do with. Your culture is something you create, So this is that. So what is the precession of the equinoxes? And I spent a little time trying to explain this, and at least I hope you get the essence of what this is. The precession of the equinoxes is like a spinning top. And I'll go back to one of the right here. This is like a spinning top. And you'll see this is how the Earth behaves when it is going through precession of an equinox or the equinoxes. It's like a top spinning, and you see it spinning from side to side. So what is a precession of the equinoxes? What it is the gravitational pull of the gravitational force of the sun and the moon on the Earth's rotation. And so as these two planets pull on the Earth, it tries to pull the Earth into an upright position, like straight up here. Straight up here. And that's not going to work because it's got to be an elliptical motion or a circular motion. And so precession works like a spinning top. It doesn't spin up. It spins to the right angle, to the right side, and from angle to angle, from side to side. And that's because of the gravitational pull of the sun and the moon on the Earth. And so it pulls this in relationship to the zodiac right here. So right now, you're in this area here. Pisces, but it is being transformed into Aquarius. It's transitioning. So you're seeing the beginning of one and the end of the other. You're seeing the confused rebellion in the capital. That would be an example of a transition that is based on bull, and that whites feel they're being dispossessed because blacks are winning elections and putting people in office, including a black president that shouldn't have been there. It's theirs. And the biggest dispossessor of all, and psychologically, was Donald Trump. You know, everything is due to a conspiracy, Mr. Know Nothing. So instead of the Earth being pulled in a clockwise direction, which it does in its rotational path, and it's January, February, March, April, January, it's going from Aries to Taurus to Gemini when it's in the cyclical thing, but January is Capricorn and February is Aquarius and so forth. It is following a order that is in its orbit, that basically is its orbit. And so when you're really beginning with the beginning of this, it starts with Aries, then it goes to Taurus, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, you know, or Pisces. So that's the way it goes. But when it's being pulled by these two gravitational forces, the sun and the moon, it precesses backwards. That's what precess means. And so instead of going from Cancer to Leo, it goes from Leo to Cancer to Gemini, which is going to be the 3 cycles that I'm going to look at for this particular historical period. And that's what's called procession. And you're going to see that there's a correspondence between those signs and the energies that they emit and what's going on Earth. And I want to say again, people have choices. So it's not saying that this is dictated by what's going on there, but it's definitely influenced. It's a climate. It's an environment. It's an astronomical, astrological energy climate. So when the Earth precesses, it precesses through the 12 zodiacal signs, and the overall precession is 26,000 years. Now, that's not actually accurate. It's a little bit less, and it varies a little bit. But 26,000 years is the precession through these 12 zodiacal signs with sub-cycles of 2,100 years approximately. Because if you add it up, you'll see that's less than that. But each cycle isn't even. You know, that's how life moves. It's uneven. As the Earth changes in its precessional cycle, in relationship to these different signs that are overhead, then the climate on Earth, when it comes to the spiritual, philosophical issues that come out of a sign, are going to be affected by that. So in the case of the Pisces age, the Piscean age had a heavy religious overtone to it over a 2,100 year previous period. You had empires rising based on religion, you know, and wars fought over it. And sometimes it was peaceful, but in other times it was warlike. And, you know, you had them all over the planet Earth. A lot of blood was shed on this, and a lot of emphasis was placed on this. People's lives were dedicated to this. And so that's the nature of these processional cycles. And so what I want to go through now is how this worked in terms of understanding ancient Kemet. And the focus is going to be on the 10,000 year period starting 10,000 BC. And then that subcycle that goes on for approximately 2,100 years. And so we're going to start with the first subcycle in ancient Kemetic history. And so what was that subcycle? In the precession of the equinoxes, where the sun and the moon is pulling the earth into this wobble like a top, it is now pointing, the earth is pointing towards the zodiacal symbol of, guess what? Leo. And so what happens then is that with this gravitational pull, the Kemetic priests who are looking at this, they're able to notice something, because what we note from this zodiac again is, as the priests are looking at the zodiac, and particularly they're taking a look at the movement of stars as they're tracking them as astronomers. What they're noticing is that with the rising and setting of different stars over time, they're changing their place as they appear on the horizon. They don't appear at the exact same place. And over time, this would tell them this is precession. So the Kemites knew about the precession of the equinoxes. They had been around it almost, well, at least 10,000 years. So they had a lot of time to observe this, and they kept records of everything they observed. So what does the precession of the equinoxes have to do with the 10,000 year origin of Kemetic history? Well before this 3200 to 31 or 3300 BC period. So at the time in which 10,000 BC occurs, and I want to stress this, Sheikh Diop agrees that if you're going to trace the origin of Kemet, you got to go back 10,000 BC. That's the time period when the so-called Greek wise man Solon comes to Kemet after inaugurating reforms in Greece, and he has conversations with the great priest of Kemet. The great priest of Kemet tells Solon that he's a child, that the Greeks are not elders, meaning they're young people. They don't have enough experience to have wisdom. And Solon says that the history of Kemet can go back to written records 8,000 BC. And he said overall knowledge that has been passed on through the priesthood to 9,000 BC. So there's a general agreement that this 10,000 BC period is like a starting point. And so what do we find then in 10,000 BC? The precessional cycle caused by the Earth and Sun's gravitational pull, the Sun and the Moon's gravitational pull on the Earth, puts it in the precessional cycle of Leo, which is exactly east of the Milky Way, which is in Earth's stellar neighborhood. So it's in this ancient 10,000 BC historical period that the precession of the equinoxes is in Leo, that this great structure is built. Like a lion, you can see the nose was shot off. got a big African nose, and with the back, it could be the mane of a lion, could be the crown of a pharaoh, you know. Now, one of our great scholars is getting ready to put out a book on this period of history, Dr. Finch, and he argues that this statue is of a woman. And if it is, then that would say something really specific about this particular period of history. But what's important to note is that the processional cycle of Leo during this period is constructed a lion, which Leo is the symbol of Leo is a lion structure of huge proportions, one of the great wonders of the world. And so it is during this period that this structure is created, indicating that the processional cycle, the climate of this time, inspired this kind of creation. Now, this is telling you a lot. The ancients, that is, the people who lived during the dynastic period, knew nothing about how this was built, exact time in which it was built, or the civilization that built it. But clearly, it took a great civilization to build a structure like this. And it was obviously a structure that embraced the people that built it, extolled them. And so for pharaohs that would come in the dynastic period, they considered this a sacred spot, you know, and they would go there to worship. And some pharaohs had insights that came from this. Now, what we also know is that during this period, after this Sphinx was built, the erosion around it indicates that water, all of this area here, that water had eroded it. So after it was built, there was some flooding of the Nile that came up high on this statue. And so we know that this is a period of great creativity and great ancient nature. And this is the opening of Kemetic civilization. And this is between 10,000 and 9,000 BC in its creation. Now, I'll go back to these others. During this same period, the people of this period, 9,500 BC, these are some of the implements they made. These are all flint work. And you can see some of these are arrow points, you know. And the Chwa were good at hunting. In the beginning, they were hunter-gatherers. We're going to see that this is a branch of the Chwa we're talking about here. And then you see other forms of flint work here, you know. Now, what's amazing about, and I studied this, a lot of the artifacts during this period, there's hardly a weapon during this period. You could call these weapons, but these are largely hunting weapons. You're not going to see what you see when you go into Europe, sharp-pointed spears and knives and every kind of weapon you can think of. There are a few, but very few. This is early ancient pottery. And what you're seeing is, like in most civilizations, the pottery evolves in terms of its design and style. And so this is very basic, this kind of style here, not very evolved. This is kind of interesting, this right here, you know. But basically, you're seeing a very basic thing. Now, here's the thing to note. In almost all of these carvings, you find natural combs. And these natural combs are almost always made out of ivory. So that's telling you something else. And they're not only using ivory for natural combs. Who uses natural combs? double old soul, us. You know what I mean? Huh? If you go into the finds in Europe to go back a fair amount of time, you're not going to find a single natural chrome. Of course, you're not. You know. Now, a key thing to note here is the Venus figure here. This is showing you the sacred nature of the woman, and particularly the woman with the big behind, the large size, which in African standards of beauty, this is the African standard of beauty, by the way, when an African woman, traditional times and even sometimes now, before she was going to get married, they put her in a fat farm so she could gain weight, because beauty was conceived as a big woman, big mama, you know. The blues have songs about that, what the big mama is going to do. But the key thing is, this is a sacred symbol. These women here were conveyors of spirit power. And in fact, all of these objects here, their main purpose was ritual purposes for sacrifice. And then, of course, carrying grain for food, you know. You can see the presence of a few foreigners here. Those aren't Africans. You'll see a few of those. And again, things that are used to hold things, usually made out of ivory. These are usually made out of ivory. So one of the characteristics of this 9,500 BC pottery is it's just being shaped. It's not highly artistic, but you're going to see where it is. Look at this. First of all, a boat with oars. I'm going to tie this in later into the people who founded Kemet and what they did in its founding. But in dynastic Kemet, you didn't have hardly any wild animals. So this is telling you during the ancient period, you had giraffes and other animals. And then you were growing grain. And then again, you see the pottery is becoming more evolved, you know. Again, the Venus figure. Now, what's interesting here is a big woman with the big hips, but it's the scare and the breasts. And this is ivory. But what's key is the scarification, which is telling you this is a person who's gone through initiation. This is clearly African. You hear me? Clearly African. And then you're seeing the other shapes of pottery. And then again, flint. And here you could say, well, yeah, this is something you could stick somebody with. But very few of these. You find very few of these. And then again, the ivory natural cone. And what in the early period is important, very often characterized by the bird. Now, Petrie is considered the authority, a guy named Petrie. I don't consider him an authority. He's got some good material to look at, but what he does when he interprets these evidences of these ancient African people is he refers to this as European. These objects come from Europe. And when it's obviously a big mama, he calls them slaves. There were no slaves in Kemet at that time. Slavery gets introduced when the Hyksos are thrown out. Some of them remain as slaves. You know what I mean? This whole story that slaves built the pyramids and everything else, bull. Not true. So he whitens this whole history, and we're talking 9,500 BC here. There's no evidence of the Aryan 9,500 BC. So how in the hell could it be them? You know what I mean? But that's their attempt to rewrite history, but it won't work. Okay, so what you're seeing then in these processional cycles And from the evidence here, I'm showing you some carvings and stuff. You're getting an idea of the creativity of the people. And you're seeing that these are people that have an appreciation for beauty. And these signs that you're finding on this kind of pottery is an interesting indication, because in Kemetic, it's called art, but they had no concept of art because everything in Africa was spirit-based. In Kemet, you had carvings of people that were actual representation of the person. And then you had the abstraction, which was symbolic. So you could have a human being with the head of the falcon on it. And so that is telling you that this person is of a royal nature. Horus descended to be, if it's a young man, to be Pharaoh or Pharaoh. So what you have is abstraction and symbolism mixed. But here, you're seeing this inclination that would be developed. And this particular feature here is characteristic of art or carvings found in the rocks among the Chua people. So this is the nature of some of what was going on at this time. It's telling you these are creative people. They're living peaceful lives. Women are very central, and they care enough about their hair. They're going to comb it not just with a natural comb, but an ivory natural comb. Of course, now you're all going to put that down because you're killing elephants. But in this case, it was hunting. They weren't killing off species of animals. And you might say, well, this indicates that there was royalty during this period. Not necessarily, because our people have always had a sense of being royal to begin with. You know what I mean? So they didn't have to have royalty at this time to show that. So this is the processional cycle of Leo, and a 10,000 year period. So as the cycle shifts and you go into what in the Western system would be called Cancer, because it's going backwards from Leo to Cancer rather than Cancer to Leo, because it's going backwards. In Kemet, Kepra approximated Cancer. And Kepra is my netter. This ring right here is the beetle, And I have beetle symbols all over the place. Right here, this I always have seated, sitting right in front of my computer, The beetle pushing up the sun. Kepra or Kepri. They have different ways of pronouncing it. So this slide here is Kepra pushing the sun. It is indicating that this cycle that occurs around 7,900 BC, when the Earth's gravitational pull of the sun and the moon is pulling it towards the sign of Kepra, or in the West, Cancer. Now, Kepra symbolizes the union of masculine and feminine, and it symbolizes the sun at sunrise. And so, symbolizing the union of masculine and feminine and the sun at sunrise, it symbolizes creativity. Coming through the union of masculine and feminine. Kepra, in theory, was taught throughout Africa and in Kemet to be androgynous. They knew it wasn't, but treating it as though two sexes were combined in one beetle. It was not, but it was symbolizing that, because that's the basis for creativity. So this would indicate that this period of 7,900 BC was a period of creativity and a period in which women probably wielded a great deal of power. And it should be noted, as I note, and I'm going to go into this in a minute in another way, that Kemet was twin lineal. That is, lineage coming from mother and father, inclining towards the female. And so a person's last name came from the mother. The head of the family was the mother's eldest brother. And it was the women who were the agriculturalists of ancient Kemet. They chose among them one called Shepsut, Shepsut. That's where the term Hatshepsut comes from. You never know it by studying dynastic history. And so Kemet's economy was based on the female, and the female ran the marketplace. The men were at home making clothes or they tended cattle, the everyday men. But the women tended the field, and when a parent was sick, it was the daughter that was responsible for caring for the family. So it was heavily female-centered. So this period of creativity, women would have had great power in this period, males and females. This is the twin lineal legacy of the Trois, but inclining towards the females. And it is very likely that this is before the Pharaonic civilization. And the reason I say that is it would take a long time to build a Pharaonic civilization, and a lot of choices that these Africans would have to make, because it would in some ways be a departure from their way of life before. So when I identify these people, you'll see why this is probably the case. But this had to be a very creative period. And again, it's why the objects that you saw preceding this, there's hardly any weapons. It's a peaceful period. Though they lived in enclosed areas to protect themselves from any strangers that might do them harm. They were prepared to defend themselves. But this was not a warlike civilization. Now, as the processional cycles change, it moves from Cancer or Kepra the beetle, 7,900 BC for 2,100 years approximately. You go into the processional cycle in the West, it's called Gemini, but I know correctly for the Kemites would be Shu Tefnut. And these are the twins in Kemet. Just as Gemini represents twins, Shu Tefnut are the twins who separated heaven from earth. And this period here begins around 5,800 BC. Now, I want you to note, because now we know more about this period, and so we can show the conformity between the symbolism of Shu Tefnut, representing twinness, the cooperation between two forces. You see one that is a female lioness and the other a male, their cooperation. And so this idea of twinness clearly reflects what's going on historically during this particular historical period. Because what's happening during this historical period? You have the emergence of pharaohs, and they're wearing two crowns. And you're going to see the first pharaoh in a minute. They're governing twin kingdoms of the south, with its capitals in a place called Nekhen, or Nekhen, Nekhen, and Nekheb, Nekheb. Twin capitals. Notice the sign is twin, and what's happening is twin governance, twin capitals. The kingdom of the north is the twin capital of DEP and PE. This is the historical period where the historical philosophy, that is, the deep philosophy of Kemet is fully formed. And it is a philosophy of twinness and unicity. And so, as I pointed out before, it is cosmic logic that Africans are operating on before. I have shows that deal with this, how you make the lower mind, the despiritualized mind of spirit, subordinate to the higher mind of spirit. And in Kemet, they were never separated. And so, whereas life and death is separate in the Kemetic mentality or philosophy, life is slow dying. Death is a rebirth to a new life. The Kemites were the first to discover that the soul is eternal. And all great systems teach this. That Ba that's inside of you, that's God inside of you. That's the eternal part of you that will live forever, So this is a period where what's going on above is what's going on below. Hello, are y'all getting any of this? So I'm breaking this down. I mean, you don't need to know astrology. And someone asked, how can they learn astrology? Someone gave them a tip, and you go to the click in. When you watch the show, click in, and you'll see the address of my sister. She can train you in astrology. I got no time for that. She's a master of that, Sandrea Bradley, and she does that for a living. And when you do something for a living, then you get really good at it, especially when you have a gift, and she has a gift. Higher Hecka here has, back in the house, huh? Procession, 26,000 year cycle. How long were ancient Kemites here to observe and understand the time cycle? Longer than 26,000 years? We know for sure 10,000. And we also know from the megaliths that are found near Giza, they actually trace the orbit of the stars, particularly Orion, back 16,500 years. It doesn't mean they were there then, but it means they knew the cycle, the length of the cycle. So, but the Twa was there for the whole time. They observed this many times. They're the authors of this, and we're going to see in a minute who the founders of Kemet was, conclusively. You're going to see why I don't use the term when I'm referring to this ancient period as pre-dynastic. Hell no. You know what I mean? So I can't say exactly when did the Kemites come here. And by the way, the migratory routes would have been along the Nile Valley, and they would have definitely come from the Congo, where the second oldest Twa come from, and would probably also come from the Kun, coming out of the Kalahari Desert. They were the first to migrate into Europe, and in all likelihood, they were the first, along with their close ancestral people, the Biaka Twa, that come from the Congo. And Diop himself notes that migratory route. And by the way, the geography of Kemet is going down, So it's not the way you would think it would be. So they'd be going down the Nile into Kemet. The brother that woke me up, Norman K. Brown, teach, brother, loves you, woke me up. And now he's telling me to teach. Right on, Norman. Norman's still the person I go to at advice. I'm in a trap and can't get out of it. I call Norman. Hey, thanks, Norman. Glad you're in the house, brother. You know what I mean? One of my favorite people, So, who were the founders of ancient Kemet? Oh, that's the question. Uh-oh. Now, some of you have heard me refer to this before, but not this way. I don't repeat myself. I don't go and give the same speech twice. You know what I mean? I don't do that. So I'm going somewhere else with this. So who were the founders of ancient Kemet? The founders of the ancient Kemet were the Anu, A-N-U, Anu, which means the great ones. Which is these 4 vertical registers on the top there, you know? That means in Medu Neter script, great ones. Hello. Now, that's a statement in and of itself. You see, Muhammad Ali said, I'm the greatest before he became so. But he established the fact that he was at least one of the greatest heavyweights. Most boxing experts say Sugar Ray Robinson was the greatest boxer ever. And what tends to reaffirm that one is Muhammad Ali patterned his style after Sugar Ray Robinson. And when he knocked Sonny Liston flat to the ground, the person who was there at the weigh-in and the person who was there at the victory was Sugar Ray Robinson. And one of his best people was assigned to, of course, it was Muhammad Ali's choice to work with him, coined the term, what is it? Fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali had a grace of a middleweight, but more important, the character of a heavyweight human being, though someone has pointed out he wasn't perfect and he had some shortcomings. But his character stands. That's what made him strong, his character. And that's what makes us strong as a people. So based on my research, I conclude that it's incorrect to define the period of Kemetic history from 10,000 BC to 3,400 or 32 or 3,100 as pre-dynastic. Why? Use common sense. I'm going to show you in a minute. Because it is the Anu that gave birth to the first pharaohs, that gave birth to the dynasty. So how can this be pre-dynastic? Huh? And it was the Anu who, in creating this dynastic system, created all the other elements of Kemetic civilization. That's what entitles them to say that they're the great one. The Book of the Dead, Anu, the priesthood of Ani, I'll get into in a minute what that represents. You know, all the great works, Anu. Tehuti was Anu. He is the one credited with most of the inventions during this ancient period. Anu. Uh-oh. Now, so the correct terminology for this period is a historical period. I didn't invent this. I'm not doing this. I don't do that. You know what I mean? I'm defining what they said they were. This is the historical period of the great ones, and the only ones greater than them were the ancestors that gave birth to them, the Chwa, because the Anu are agrarian Chwa, who decided to experiment not only with agriculture, which the Chwa gave birth to, but with urban civilization, which is what white people define as civilization, as though if you live in any other kind of society, you wouldn't be civilized. And so many of us are into the material thing. If it ain't got something equal to a skyscraper, it isn't civilized. Well, these savages have got big skyscrapers. The Germans were one of the most advanced when it came to technology and everything else. And look what they did. But they were copying America, whose society, that is Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf and everything else, wiping out everything that was different. They were copying America, as spelled with Amerikka. Huh? So if we're looking at this period, it's a period of the great ones. Well, when it comes to urban civilization, their achievements were the greatest of all. You hear me? Now, the name Anu, according to Dr. Sheikh Anadiat, derives from the god An, A-N, who was Asar, Osiris. Uh-oh. That's common because it's common for African people to situate their civilization in the founders or founder. And they might name the civilization after the founder. And so Asar is, according to dynastic Kemites and others, is the first pharaoh, is the founder, and played the same role that the Twa played in Africa, in the Niger-Congo Bantu region, the show that I gave on ancestral power. They were civilizing the wild Bantu people, the taller people who lived in society centered on females. They were democratic, they were agrarian, but they didn't know the first thing about civilized behavior. They didn't know about prohibitions on incest. The Twa taught them. They didn't know how to cook meat. They were eating it raw, you know what I mean? But they were not bad people. But they had to be refined. That was the role that Asar played in Kemet. He said he took the people from the wild state, and this was both Asar and Aset. It took them from the wild state to the civil state, you know? So the Anu are the founders of ancient Kemet, and the title of Asar was also Ani, A-N-I, which also Anu is derived from, Ani. And it's the priesthood of Ani where the great powers were expressed, spiritual powers and whatnot. And they still maintain a priesthood of Ani during dynastic Kemet. Flinders Petrie, who I generally don't quote, but on this one I will, makes this observation of the Anu. He says this. He says, from Giza and Turah, T-U-R-A-H, for 350 miles, there is no difference in the proto-dynastic work. He's referring to this ancient period. And the same is true of the earlier prehistoric times for more than 300 miles from Gerza to Naquata. Moreover, 200 miles further south in Nubia, the cycles of this age are perfectly continuous, although mixed with other types, which belong to Nubia. Thus, for over 500 miles, the prehistoric, this is the ancient Anu civilization, seems to have been so well organized and unified that the same taste, ideas, patterns, and materials prevailed throughout. This shows that there were not isolated and warring tribes which prevented intercourse and trade, but rather a peaceful, if not a unified, rule over all Egypt and Nubia. How is it that you look at this dynastic period and you don't look at the founders who had unified the country longer than the dynastic period and in a peaceful state, and out of that created virtually all the elements of Kemetic civilization other than pyramid building? I'd say that that was the real contribution of dynastic Kemet, is that they built pyramids, you know? So who were the founders? They were Anu, you know? Now, I've explained this before. When I was writing this book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by a choice between two cultures, I read Petrie's work, and I read his translation of this cover. This cover, this picture, is the best proof of who the founders were. And note, it depicts the founders, what they look like, but also in Medu-Neter script. So you're seeing the writing of ancient Kemet. I don't read Medu-Neter. I can tell you a few symbols, but I don't read it. So I go to people with the expertise. And Obenga is the foremost one. I had him out at state. So I asked Obenga to translate this. Obenga does not study the ancient period. So this was all news to him. And I questioned whether Petrie was accurate in his description or translation of this symbolism right here. So this was Petrie's translation. He says, in Hemen, Hemen, city, Hemen is the name of a city. This is Obenga translating him. But Petrie says himself that Hemen was the name of the god Tupian, 13 miles south of Luxor. There is a contradiction. So he's first of all saying that what Petrie is saying is confused. He's confusing himself between a city named Hemen and a god who's called Tupian. It's not clear. He goes on to explain, Obenga, that Petrie's interpretation, this is his reading of this symbol here, that Petrie's interpretation that Terra Netta is the name of a chief. So Petrie is saying this person here is Terra Netta. This person here is Terra Netta. So Obenga, and so he's a chief, and he poses a problem because he says, quote, Obenga, Netter or God is almost never included in a proper name, even royal names. Uh-oh. Huh. So a human being wouldn't have the name Netter. So this is Obenga's summation of Petrie's interpretation with the following conclusion. Palace of the Anu, A-N-U, in Hemen, H-E-M city. Terra Netta means what exactly? The name Terra Netta is not in opposition with Palace of Anu. Therefore, Petrie's translation is not clear at all. Obenga's translation of this Medu-Neter script is as follows. This one, he says, the great ones of the palace and the city of the god Hemen, who show respect for the god that is the king of Kemet. The great ones, these three registers, the great ones, one of whom is this one, has come to worship the god who is this one, who is not Horus. This is Set. And when I showed you the pictures of natural cones, that was Set on the top of it. That's telling you this historical period. So this one is a great one who has come to worship the god in the palace of Hemen. So Obenga goes on to show that how he reached his translation, that the three vertical registers means great ones. And then palace or temple, worship or show respect, netter or god. So this is not a netter here, but this one has come to show respect to the god, the netter, not Lord Terra Netter. So what Petrie missed and Obenga grasped was that the great one had come to worship and show respect for a being greater than himself, the god that is the king of Kemet. The king or pharaoh which also meant great house, was the state of Kemet. And really, Kemet had no state, because state in the Western concept means instruments of violence. That's your army, your police, your National Guard, your intelligence agency, FBI, CIA, all of this. In the West, that's how they govern, because they're stealing from the people. And if you steal from the people, your state has to force them in line. Obenga and I talked about this, that in ancient Africa, most African societies had no armies. First of all, they were living in peace, and their leaders had no reason to have an armed guard or anything else, because they were living justly. They weren't ripping the people off. You hear me? Huh? And so what you find then is this idea of state. Pharaoh was symbolic of the government, and Pharaoh was considered God. So the king or Pharaoh, great house, was the center of government of Kemet, as this relief indicates. The Anu had established a Pharaonic system of governance during this ancient period. Moreover, these ancient pharaohs were Anu or Chwa. Do you see this? These were Chwa who had decided to experiment with governance and building urban civilization. They had decided to experiment with that. And so these same little people transformed themselves into the founders of this civilization. So the Chwa start off history as hunter-gatherers without kings and queens, and then experiment with agrarian democracies as they begin to move into agriculture. And then larger Africans come out of that, and they experiment with that. But the key point is the governing principle was all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society. So in the small societies of Africa coming after the hunter-gatherer period, the villagers ruled those societies, and those were the most just to live in after the hunter-gatherer. And my reasoning is that this period prior to pharaohs, you had that same input, males and females. And I found out something else. While Asar was married to his sister, so you had royal incest, and that was because then he could assume power through the line of the woman, because the woman carried royal power. There's a period in Kemet, and it may have been after Asar, where things changed for a while, where the Shepsuits picked the pharaohs, and there were many pharaohs picked under this system. Females picked the males. And this is similar to the system you find in Ghana, where you have the Asantehene Asantewa. There was a period in Ghana where women ruled. The Bono Kingdom, Bono, women ruled. Then a time where war came, and so they shifted to a dual stool system, that is, where Queen Mother Asantewa and a king, an Asantehene, co-ruled under the leadership of a council that made the ultimate decisions, who represented the lineages in the villages. They were lineage heads. They were the most just among the lineage heads, the ones that didn't lie, didn't steal, didn't curse, didn't abuse women or children, that were brave in war parties. One among them would become pharaoh. Leadership in Africa was determined by best man, not this stuff that you see in Wakanda and stuff where they're fighting each other for control. No, that isn't how it worked. It was based on the qualities. So in the case of the Asantehene Asantewa Ghana system, the Queen Mother nominated the king, the Asantehene. She had 3 nominations, and at least one of those was always, accepted by the council for kingship or a Santahina ship. She and the consul then trained the king, and the king had to give up his wealth. He was decked always in gold and all of this refined stuff. It didn't belong to him. It belonged to the people. And he did not make the final decision. The consul did. So there's a period in Kemetic history, starting with this period here of Shu Tefnut, where the pharaoh was picked by the women. That's a male-female governance system. That would later change. That's generally not noted. And I'll say this again. You measure the level of civilization by the power of the balance between males and females, the balance of power between males and females. When they are equally empowered, you're going to have a just society. And to the extent that either one is downgraded, you're going to have injustice. So the Anu are the founders of ancient Kemet, going back 10,000 BC. One of the key characteristics of the Anu, when you see the Anu being depicted, or here, only they are depicted in the Pharaonic status. All other people who are not Anu are portrayed in a servile status. So this is real key. Now, who was Asar? Now, I'm the first one to say this, and I think I got backup for this. This is Asar. You've seen, some of the people who watched the show before, you have seen me use this before. And notice, this is a real person. This is not a general carving that would just be a carving of just, could be anyone. And if you look at some of the carvings of pharaohs in the dynastic period, like the Ramses statues, these are superhuman carvings. That's not the way Ramses actually looked. They didn't have no gym where you're lifting weights. These guys here are muscle bound. But if you look at the pharaoh Akhenaten, that is a real portrayal of how he looked. He had a little pot belly and wasn't muscular. That was him. This is him. And how do I know this is him? This comes from Herodotus on history, where he describes the way in which the Kemites kept records of both their chief priests and pharaohs. And this comes from eyewitness account in that he could actually see this. So page 131 and 132, Herodotus on history. He's referring to how the priest kept a record of all their rulers going back to the beginning. And also kept a record of their chief priest, both of them. And what he notes is that this was a record that consisted of 10,000 years of the history of chief priests and pharaohs. And he even went as far as to say 11,340 years, but generally it's a 10,000 year period of history where he says, thus far I have spoken on the authority of the Egyptians and their priests. They declare that from their first king to this last mentioned monarch, the priest of Vulcan was a period of 341 generations. Such, at least they say, was the number of both of their kings and their high priests during this interval. And then he goes on to say this was a period of 10,000 years. And then he goes on to make this comment. And I've referred to this before, but not quoted directly from the source. He was allowed to enter one of the holies of holies, a temple where all of these statues were kept, wooden statues of their pharaohs and their chief priests. And he said, they led me into the inner sanctuary, which is a spacious chamber, and showed me a multitude of colossal statues in wood, which they counted up, and being for every high priest and rulers his lifetime to set up his statue in the temple. As they showed me the figures and reckoned them up, they assured me that each one was the son of one of the previous ones. And then he goes on and on to show that they were listing their great priest and their rulers, all of them. This is a wooden carving of Asar. And you'll see in some of the actual renderings of carvings of Asar that are more formal, some actually try and copy this. But this is the real person because it's the likeness of a specific human being. Obviously an African, and obviously spiritual. Look at those eyes. But it's made out of wood the same way all of these pharaohs and chief priests were carved. That was for record keeping. And so this is a picture of Asar, and Asar is wearing the two crowns, the white crown and then the crown of the ram, which only Asar wore and probably other pharaohs following him, but dynastic Kemites did not, representing the fact that he ruled the entire country. All of it. Every last bit of it. Here you see a map of ancient Kemet. And these were some of the cities that the Anu ruled. And they included Aunt, Hermothesis, traditional birthplace. And this is blocking the other cities, but the Anu ruled all of Kemet, ancient Kemet at that time. And Dendera, where we saw the temple of Dendera, Heliopolis, that isn't noted. So this is the rulership going south and north. So Asar is the great ancestor, chief priest, and pharaoh of Kemet. Now, I will conclude this by Twa stories, which I've mentioned before in previous shows. The Twa say that they built a civilization called Kimi, K-I-M-I. They say they built boats and sailed on the waters and built a great civilization. And then they tired of it and left it because exercising power did not make them happy. That may be why they left it. They may also have left it because the larger Africans whose netter for rule was Horus displaced them. And we know Menes was of that group. So Menes owed the civilization that he inherited to the Anu, the great ones, who decided to retreat from the civilization they had built and again enter a life of simplicity and happiness, where happiness, as they said, and I said in a previous show, involved bringing the antelope home and putting a smile on your wife's face and putting a smile on your children's face.